Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Mastering Show. My name is Ian Shepherd. I'm a mastering engineer, and I run a website called Production Advice, aimed at helping you get the best results recording, mixing, and mastering your music. And this episode, I have another repeat guest. This time it's Joe Caithness, who was previously on episode 88, talking about whether DJs really want loud masters, and if so, why and what that even means. So I highly recommend you check out that episode where we also talk a little bit more about how Joe got into mastering in the first place. But Joe, welcome back.
Hello, thanks so much for having me back on the podcast.
No, it's great to have you. And in fact, the reason that you're back is that you reached out to me asking if I wanted to do an episode on this specific topic, which is clipping. And my answer to that was hell yes, because I don't know about, well, I do know about you, Joe, because we've kind of talked about this. I don't know about anybody else listening, but it feels like all I see right now is people talking about clipping. There's people with new clipping plugins. There's people introducing it as a concept, something you can do. And everybody seems to be saying it's the answer to everything. You know, it gives you transparent gain increases. It gives you punch. It gives you impact. It gives you detail. It doesn't damage the audio. And from my perspective, sometimes some of those things are true. And sometimes, most of the time, most of them are not true. And a lot of the time, none of it is true. Clipping is a super useful option when you want to control peak levels in particular, or when you want to add tone and color to a musical signal. I've been using it for, I think, about 25 years, definitely 20 years. But for me, it's not always the right thing, and often it's completely the wrong thing. So we want to try and talk about that, demystify it, and we want to add a caveat right up the front. Neither Joe nor I are software programmers or electronics engineers. We're going to do our best to get all of this technically accurate, but please be kind with us if we get something slightly wrong. But hopefully this will be a useful conversation. So, Joe, maybe you could kick it off by describing in your words what clipping is, how you think about it, and what it does.
Yeah, so it does seem at the moment that as far as marketing goes, at least for plugins specifically, clipping is being described as pretty much everything. I've seen it described as limiting, compression, EQ, pretty much any of the standard functions of digital audio processing that you can think of, that you might have a plugin of in your DAW. I've seen clipping described as that. And of course, that can't be true. And like a lot of things, I mean, often mastering is a bit like this. The more simple it is, the more people sort of over-egg the description. And then you end up with this sort of mystified, confused group of people who have these processors but aren't entirely sure what they're doing, when in reality, what a clipper is doing is actually one of the most simple things you can do in digital audio. The easiest way to think about it is that a clipper is a wave shaper. So it could be a hard clip, which basically says that once you hit the threshold, every sample is the same, which is the same as just hitting 0 dBFS in your DAW. There's no more values to hit. So it just pins it at that point. So if you've got a hard clipper and you're putting the threshold down, say -3 dBFS, for example, every sample that goes above that will just equal -3 dBFS. When you come to soft clipping, essentially all you're doing is putting a transfer curve into that. So as you reach that point of the final clip, there is a curve, a little bit like a knee on a compressor. So if you've ever seen a transfer curve, it's basically a line that changes in a certain way, could be logarithmic, could be anything you want, basically. And different types of distortion are created digitally by choosing what equals what when you go on a certain point on that transfer curve. One of the best ways to look at this is to get Plugin Doctor. I mean, if you don't have Plugin Doctor already, I think every audio engineer should have Plugin Doctor. Put a clipper in of any description, make sure the threshold is being exceeded, and then look at the dynamics window, and you will see that curve. It will literally plot it exactly as you look at on a compressor plugin, and you'll be able to see where it can't go any further, and also you'll be able to make some decisions about the ratio of how it's doing that. So if it reaches a certain point, is it halving it? Is it, a third of the original gain? And that's all it really is. It's basically taking a value and saying, no, this value is now this value instead. And that causes all kinds of changes.
I think that's a great start. And the only thing I would add to what you just said there is that obviously we're talking about digital clipping. You can also have analog clipping, but you can't have analog clipping that sounds like hard digital clipping. Hard digital clipping only happens in digital. The soft digital clipping that we're talking about, where rather than just slicing the peaks off the top of the waveforms, as soon as it exceeds that threshold, 0 or wherever it is, there's just nothing above it. Soft digital clipping, it'll either, this is one of the confusing things, of course, is that all the plugins implement it differently. We're going to get into that in more detail. But so sometimes you hit the threshold and then it will start to reduce the values up to a certain maximum. Sometimes the maximum is what the plugin calls the threshold. But anyway, at some point, the sample values, the waveform peaks can't get any higher and they stop. So the value where that maximum level is, if it's a straight change from no change at all, this is the input signal, and then boom, stop there, you can't go any higher, that's hard digital clipping. Soft digital clipping will have that rounded shape to the transfer curve that you mentioned, and that's more like what you get in an analog situation. That's to some extent a digital emulation of analog style clipping that you might get from gear back in the day.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why that's called, we sometimes call it saturation, especially plugins which are trying to emulate some sort of vintage style distortion, is because with analog equipment, say for example a transformer, where you're going from one coil to the other, the saturation is the point where electrons can't move from one side to the other. It's a little bit like that thing you do at school where you put lots of salt in a glass of water and it reaches saturation point. It's the same physical function. It's just that in digital audio, because it's instantaneous, you can say, no, the second it reaches this thing happens. Whereas in analog, there's a transition between two stages, two like electromagnetic stages, or between two components within an amplifier, for example, like a diode or something like that. Whereas digital, it's as inverted commas clean as you want in that respect.
Okay, so I think we've defined what clipping is. It's when the signal reaches a certain level and gets changed, usually by being restricted to not going above a maximum value. And as you mentioned, that causes audible changes to the signal. So let's talk about some of what you might hear if you start applying clipping to a signal. Maybe if we start with hard digital clipping.
Yeah, so one of the things you might have seen in your DAW if you load something back in which is clipped is you get what is essentially a square wave at the very, very top of the signal. And one of the things we know about square waves is they are just harmonics. Mathematically speaking, you can't get a perfect square wave, but the idea is that they are just harmonics. So if you've got a signal which is being hard clipped, it means that anything that's hitting into that threshold or that point in the plugin, you're going to be creating instantaneous harmonics at that point, which is possibly one of the most overused things that I find in mixes, because the harmonics that it creates go on very, very, very high, basically up until the bandwidth of the audio, the session itself. So when you're hard clipping stuff, you're creating lots and lots of instant harmonics that are potentially very complex and are going into all the other parts of your gain structure and all that kind of business. And that is something that not everybody can hear, and it's something that not as great monitoring setups, rooms, speaker systems, headphones, etc., can really reproduce, but they are baked into the audio. So the classic one is people putting a hard clipper on, say something like a tom drum mic or a kick drum. You might reduce the level and you think, wow, I'm not going so much into the limiter and I'm getting a much cleaner signal. But what you might not realize is every time that clipper is engaged, you're creating all of these like super high frequency harmonics, which are going to end up going downstream into the mastering DAW, and then we're going to add other nonlinear things and EQ, etc. And that's when you can really start getting into the nastiness and the problems of overusing, especially hard clipping. Soft clipping also creates harmonics. Essentially, the best way to look at this, again, is to go into Plugin Doctor, do that thing I said earlier, put the clipper in at a certain point, have a look at the transfer curve, then go over to the harmonics tab, and then pull the plugin in and out, and you will see exactly the harmonics that transfer curve causes. And the fun really starts when you then change if you've got a plugin with a warpable transfer curve, maybe one that goes all the way from hard to completely soft, like Newfangled Saturate does that, for example. You can literally see the harmonics that are being created for whatever test tone you put in. And it's very complex, and it changes a lot. And it's quite hard to hear these things straight away. And the good plugin designers will have very good gain structure, so you can keep it neat while you're doing this, but will also have certain sort of designer curves that suit certain materials. Sometimes this is why I think people say, oh, it's like tonal change or EQ, because it's adding harmonics, which then changes the perceived tonal balance of the audio. But you can do basically any tonal change with clipping. You can add some really, really, really smooth curve that adds loads of like low frequency, low mid harmonics, or you can, like I said earlier, you can smash drums into it and with hard clipping create loads of insane top end. So this is where the problems come in, where people suggest that you just whack a clipper on something. It's almost like saying you just whack an EQ curve on something and just randomize the EQ curve. It doesn't really mean anything until you get into designing what you actually want to do with it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, especially this is all about adding harmonics. And the question is, what harmonics get added and what do they do when they're added? So we're going to also talk about intermodulation distortion, which is where not only do you get the harmonic, but you get nonlinear distortion from that harmonic. And for anybody who's not familiar with the term nonlinear, we did a whole episode on linear versus nonlinear processing of the Mastering Show, which we'll put in the show notes at themasteringshow.com if you want to check that out. We also get aliasing distortion, and there was also an episode on aliasing, which we'll put in the show notes as well. But we're going to we'll dig into both of those. I think before we do, though, we should probably talk about the way that clipping is often used in combination with a limiter to share the load between the two and how that works.
Yeah, so one of the most common tutorials that you'll find will be essentially taking stuff out of your final limiter, sort of de-emphasizing before you hit a limiter to reduce the amount of limiting happening. And this is something that I do quite a lot. And this is mostly where I use soft clipping, wave shaping, etc., which is to say, for example, you've got a track where the limiter is hitting into something you don't want it to hit into. Usually you want the limiter to just dig into things like drums or just the ultimate fastest transient material, because it can kind of neatly tuck them down and then the audio moves on and does its thing. But what you might see is that when you're looking at your limiter and you're looking at the gain reduction meter, is it's being triggered by stuff which is not part of those instantaneous sounds. Like, for example, a held bass note. That's one of the worst sounds. If you ever want to hear what a really badly gained mastering session sounds like, put a sustained subnote hitting your limiter, because it does all kinds of mad stuff. The problem is with using it that way for some people is that the way the gain structure actually works within the clipper changes depending on the way the software is designed. So you might have your perfectly set threshold, ceiling, etc. for your limiter, and then you'll put a plugin in front of it, and the actual output of the plugin isn't equal to what the input of the plugin is. So you actually might be turning it down too much or turning it up too much. And once you add in the perceived loudness effect of adding harmonics, it can get very confusing very, very quickly. The software that I use generally for this has either a almost perfect makeup at the end of it, whether it's a mathematically determined one or it uses scanning the actual loudness itself and then applies that makeup, or it has a simple downward style threshold to it. So the TC algorithms, which have been around for a very long time, basically work by just going downwards. So you're just pulling the threshold down, essentially. Whereas something like Newfangled Saturate, which is one that I use quite a lot, has a very clever gain structure inside it. So as you change the style and the shape and all of the parameters inside it, it keeps that actual level of gain reduction balanced. So you can sort of design your curve while keeping this, maybe I want to take 2 dBs out of the limiter. You can kind of keep that there, but you can change the sound of it, and then you kind of get into the tone shaping qualities and, you know, kind of trying to hide the distortion or using the distortion to enhance the signal. And that's where you get into the sort of like super tier soft clipping stuff, where you can not only reduce the stress on the limiter, but you can also add something which is desirable. Now, plugins like the famous Sonox Inflator, which has also been around forever, has a different way of dealing with gain structure that is quite, I would say, unintuitive. And that can make it quite difficult to do this whole in front of a limiter type thing. And people will end up accidentally nudging their gain structure. And then, as we know in mastering, once you change the gain structure and you've got non-linear stuff, the whole thing just is thrown out. You know, you lose all your perfect settings and everything that you've balanced running from plugin to plugin. And I think watching some of the tutorials and the advice that I read on forums and stuff, a good like 90% of them don't take this incredibly important gain structure into account.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point. And actually, maybe that is a good point to kind of move on to our next topic, which is what makes a good clipper. Because, you know, what we're both saying is that actually clipping is a relatively simple process. There are some variables that you can tweak, but it's much more about what signal you apply it to and how you apply it than super detailed nuances in the type of clipping or anything else. So for me, the most important thing about a clipper processor, plugin or whatever, is having control over everything. And yes, the gain structure is often the biggest obstacle to that, because I have the same issue with standard clip. Almost any of the controls that you dial will change effectively the input gain to the plugin. So quick tangent to say, when people are playing with this stuff in Plugin Doctor, you will need to change some of the settings. You either need to push the input level up or you need to bring the threshold down for a clipper to, if you have a signal that's not actually hitting zero or clipping, you won't see anything happening until you change the gain so that parts of the signal start exceeding the threshold. So you either bring the threshold down or push the signal level up. And actually, while we're on the subject of Plugin Doctor, it's also worth, in the dynamics section, when you're looking at the transfer curve in this way, going up and editing the input and output range scale. I think by default it's negative 100 dB up to 0 dB FS. I usually set it for looking at the transfer curves of clippers like this. I would usually set that to minus 30 up to plus 18, for example. So you can see when the clipper is allowing things through that are above 0 dB FS. And yeah, my problem with standard clip, which I think is a good option, it's affordable and it can do some useful stuff, but almost any of the controls, when you start moving them, will change the gain structure. So the signal will either get louder or softer. And then when you bypass it, you can't accurately hear what you're doing. You know, in particular, when, especially with clipping, things get pushed louder, they'll sound better to us because they're louder. And the fact that they're louder will distract us from the distortion that you mentioned that is being added to the signal. Because, I mean, there's another hopefully useful idea for people. Clipping is basically distortion. It's hopefully musical distortion, and that is appropriate for the material. Although it's never transparent, right? As soon as you add distortion to a signal, you've got something that is by definition not transparent, because you're changing the signal. That's what distortion means. But it can actually sound quite invisible. I've often talked about the fact that in mastering, one of my goals is often to be invisible, not for people not to hear the processing I'm applying, just think that the music sounds better. So not hearing attack and release times or whatever it might be, or thinking, oh, that's an amazing EQ curve. And in terms of clipping, I don't want people to kind of listen and hear distortion. I just want things to sound lively and punchy and exciting.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems when it comes to people being able to do that and achieve the sound. I mean, I often think that when I'll hear something in a mastering session, I'll have a sound in my head that I want to reach, or, you know, plus a level I want to reach and all that kind of stuff. And being able to do that on an EQ is kind of intuitive, because it's like I want to add high frequencies, so I go to the high frequency bit and I turn it up or whatever. Whereas the way most clippers are designed, there isn't a standard language or like slider or whatever that determines this. So for example, in the inflator, it's just called effect or enhance. Whereas in other things, like the TC, for example, that's threshold. And it's essentially doing the same thing, but that's very counterintuitive as far as how we know other plugins to be designed. It's like threshold and enhance, but threshold's turning something down, surely. Enhance is adding something to it. And they're both true. Also, standard clip has this quite strange thing where it uses percentages as well, which I've always found very hard to set with the soft clip pro setting on it. It's basically the percentage between two determined values, but what that means as far as the sound, it's kind of your brain's doing a lot of work to try and get to that point. And I think this is why a lot of people might try certain clippers and be like, wow, this just sounds weird, I don't like it. But also why people might just end up accidentally hitting one of these great sounds by fiddling with it and not really understanding the controls, and then overusing it by just sticking it on everything, and then creating all those kind of complex harmonics that then get further EQ and nonlinear process and stuff happens to them further downstream. So I think the biggest challenge for people who want to get into this is you might demo 3 different plugins, and they might essentially in Plugin Doctor be doing the same thing, but the controls on them and the numbers even that you type in might be completely different to each other.
I think that's absolutely right. And so it reminds me, the same can be said for a lot of compressors, right? Attack and release times on one compressor don't necessarily mean the same as the attack and release times on another compressor, but it's almost so much worse. I think the important thing that I would say to people is that if you want to use clipping, you need a way to level match the before and after. If you've got a plugin that has that built in, you mentioned Gold Clip, I think, and Saturate. Both of those have great control over the gain structure so that you can apply these processes and hear the results without being confused by a big change in level and see really clearly what's happening. So you could choose one of those that has that built in. I would say the TC is the same. The TC options tend to be much simpler than a lot of the other plugins in terms of present, like the version I use, it's built into the MD4 plugin, literally just has a threshold. I don't think you can even choose different types of clipping to be applied. And that to me is kind of easy to understand because you just wind it down and say, okay, this is going to start doing something to the signal whenever it exceeds minus 2 dB or minus 3 dB or whatever it is. And then so I can see, okay, I've got that really low and I'm not liking what I hear, or I've got it fairly high and I do like what I hear, and you make a choice about whether or not to use it. But again, the actual level of this audio signal doesn't change until you're absolutely smashing it, which is, you've got to really overdo it to achieve that. But if the plugin you want to use, like say Standard Clip or K-Clip as well, I think the gain structure is a bit complicated, and definitely the inflator. You need another way, either manually, by ear, by measuring the input and output and matching them, or you could use something like my Perception AB plugin, some kind of method of accurately matching the loudness before and after the process to hear what's happening accurately. What other ingredients then would you say are important for a good clipper? I think that the TC clipper is, so this is, okay, here's a brief tangent. I've been thinking about all of this, and I mentioned this to you before we started recording. For my entire career, I have always wanted stem separation tools in mastering, because so many times you have a master that sounds great, but you just think, if only I could edge the vocal up by half a dB or a dB so that it works even better with the compression I want to use for the track overall, for example, or, so that I don't have to apply that EQ boost to help lift it out from the rest of the track. And I was always able to find, some kind of compromise or workaround that would achieve something similar, but it was always a case of stem separation. It was this kind of magical myth, and now it exists. So as soon as I saw stem separation plugins appearing on the market that sounded decent, it was like, okay, I'm definitely going to want to add that to my toolkit, my mastering toolkit, because it's just something that I've always wanted that never existed. I've been using clipping pretty much my entire career because it was built into the really early TC, and I think even some of the you found it soft clipping stuff in some of the early Sony digital processing stuff. So it's been around since forever, but there was never a time when I thought, I wish I had a better soft clipper. I could get it to achieve what I wanted. And just for people listening, for me, usually when I would usually start without using any clipping in mastering, because I feel like saturation is kind of, there's EQ balance, that's one thing. There's dynamic management, that's another thing. And then there's adding extra harmonics. It's just kind of further down the list of things that I can do that affect the original signal. So it's not the first thing that I reach for. And we can talk about whether that's different for you, Joe. But so starting off without clipping, and usually it's when I've got something that I want to feel loud. It measures loud on the meters. It feels loud in the room in terms of the amount of sound, but it just doesn't feel loud, doesn't feel exciting enough, you know? So there are lots of times when pure compression and limiting can just sound too clean. I want a little bit of edge, grit, snap to the, you know, when you're using lots of vague words to describe the sound, but I just want a slightly more aggressive result. And that's when I might bring in clipping, because it's adding a little bit of appropriate distortion, especially to drum transients, for example. Drums have noise and distortion-like qualities in the sound anyway. Transients on anything do, but you've got big transients in drums. So clipping is a really appropriate way of achieving that result for me. So yeah, if I'm using the TC stuff, it's like, okay, I've got no clipping happening. I want to hear what it sounds like with a bit, and I just wind it in. Or I could use one or the other. So the way that I tended to use it in the past was very simple. And I could always achieve a result I was happy with a combination of that and other processes, because, you know, you've got compression and things that you can use to control the dynamics as well.
When it finally clicked for me was when I realized that you can use it to do two things at once, kill two birds with one stone, if you like. Because you can do it to add excitation, add, you know, some distortion, some character or whatever, color to the signal, whatever you want to call it. But not only does it do that, it changes the overall amplitude. So the question is, in my mind, can I take stress off the limiter while making it sound better? There's also taking stress off the limiter while making it sound like nothing, which is that thing of sort of hiding the harmonics. But there's an element of, like, sometimes it's the same with compression. Sometimes you want to control the overall level, but it like does an extra thing as well. Something like an API 2500 is famous for that, where you basically got this extra stuff baked into the sound, but you can also use it to make something sound overall louder by compressing it and therefore changing the dynamic range. Clipping is similar to that in the sense that you can sometimes get a bonus sort of characteristic from it. So talking about the TC algorithms, for example, I've used the TC stuff for a long time, all the way back to the MD2, which was their original digital toolbox thing, which is still very, very good and quite expensive to buy, from the early 90s. And one of the nice things about the TC stuff is it's very, very smooth. And even their quote unquote hard clip in their current line of limiters, the Brickwall HD, is actually only a 2-to-1 ratio, because TC have their own sort of sound signature and they're all about transparency, and they use the lot in broadcast and dialogue, and that sort of curve and that sort of setting works really well for them. You might find that something a bit more aggressive or with a bit more of a different characteristic to it might be better for another bit of audio. I mean, I really like using gold clip on dance music with sustained bass. So a lot of, especially UK dance music, has like an extra subline going the whole time, you know, whatever genre it is. And the way that the gold clip works is it has this the actual gold process in it, which is an emulation of the Lavery gold and the Civita. It starts very, very low, and it kind of increases the curve over time. Again, have a look at this in Plugin Doctor. It's very hard to do. You know, we're sort of dancing about architecture right now, trying to describe it. What that does to the overall harmonic characteristic means that not only does it turn the loudest peaks down, it adds increasingly more low frequency harmonics, which kind of adds a sort of sustained sound to it. So when you start to understand the characteristics of the harmonic change as well as the gain reduction change, you start to get into this, you know, sort of big brain mastering thinking, where you're like, okay, I can get it this loud without using this much limiting, and I can enhance the low end while I'm doing it, which in theory, you know, your instinctive thought might be, I'll use some parallel compression or whatever to increase the sustain. But sometimes these other processes can actually sound more suitable, sometimes transparent, sometimes not transparent, but they suit the audio better. And this is the thing that I think no one's really making tutorials or going into the nuance of this and explaining how they would use it in a session aesthetically as well as technically. I think that's the thing for me, is it's this combination of the technical gain reduction and the aesthetic change to the audio, whether that's hiding the harmonics or using the harmonics to enhance it.
And maybe this is a great point to kind of come back to the topic of harmonics and how they relate to wave shaping. Wave shaping is a term that describes adding harmonic, FM synthesis, where you start off with the fundamental frequency of something and then you add in harmonics to change the timbre, to change the color. Something similar happens, or something exactly the same happens when you clip or when you saturate a signal, because we're basically adding extra harmonics. And you recommended a cool YouTube video that we'll link to in the show notes again, where there's a demonstration of just adding a single extra waveform, but with the polarity inverted and the settings, so that basically it just cancels out the top part of the waveform, which looks and would sound exactly the same as having hard clipped that original sine wave. But you can do that at any level simply by adding in an extra signal to change the shape of the wave. The two things are like mirror images of each. One of them is we're talking about it in the frequency domain, and one of them we're talking about it in the time domain, in terms of because waveform is a time-based thing. Is there anything else you want to kind of say about that relationship between? I mean, I know that you like using, for example, the smooth setting on the TC clipper on the Brickwall HD plugin. So you're not necessarily using it for limiting at all, but you're using the smooth clipping signal on material that doesn't actually have. I keep talking about drums, but we're talking about an example where you used it on effectively a solo female vocal, right?
Yeah. So one of the benefits of using soft clipping instead of limiting and compression is the fact that it's instantaneous, which means that although you're adding loads more extra harmonics than you do when you're doing compression or limiting that has a sort of window where it changes in the time constant, the attack and release, you can kind of keep the overall structure of the sound. So something like a vocal, which the second you change a vocal, as I'm sure we all are aware, because of evolution, the way our ears work, you can do really weird stuff and you end up in this really uncanny situation. So if you ever over limited a vocal, it doesn't sound cool like over limiting a snare drum or something. It just sounds really strange and artificial and not nice to listen to. So you might find that you've got your loudness absolutely perfect, which I did on this track I was working on, where it's basically a solo piano and vocal, and there's a section in the track where it gets very loud for a couple of words, basically. And what I determined was it was better to have a little bit of constant soft clipping over the whole track that was quite hard to hear than have the limiter suddenly hit in that area, because your ears are used to this constant harmonic change, this slight change of the overall signal. And because that lowers the overall amplitude, when the limiter kicked in, it didn't have to kick in quite as hard. So in theory, the whole track is slightly distorted in the literal sense, but the most important part of the track that would have sounded more distorted and created a bad sounding master is allowed to be cleaner because of this sort of, it's almost like a pre-emphasis, like you're emphasizing or de-emphasizing part of the signal for something which happens further on. And the TC Brickwall HD has this really great sort of metering thing that goes along with your DAW in time. It's like it follows along with your transport, and it shows you how much of the clipping in orange and how much of the limiting is happening in yellow. And you can actually see the trade-off. If you were to loop round a section, you can balance between the two of them to the point you can have it 50-50 or whatever, percentage either way you want. And I find that's really intuitive for tuning out distortions. So it might sound slightly strange to say that I'm adding distortion to tune out distortions, but I'm tuning out time distortions as opposed to harmonic distortions. So there's always a trade-off. Anything in physics and electronics, you put something in and you get something out, but you can choose to manipulate that to hide that process, which is what I was doing in that example.
And I find that really interesting because I'm a big fan of the TC processing, but as I say, I'm using this kind of fairly simple clipping algorithm that's built into the MD4 that's kind of You just choose how much of it you want to happen. I've got the Brickwall HD plugin, and I'd never really dug into experimenting with those settings. So I'm going to be going back to some examples and trying this out. Of course, the thing that immediately occurs to me is, well, maybe rather than changing the dynamic structure of the entire track in that way, you could also use some automation just to make sure that that loudest moment of the song doesn't hit the limiter as hard. And that gets back into, there's always a million different ways to solve a challenge in music, in mastering especially. We've both talked about the idea of using clipping to reduce the load on the limiter. And I think maybe we could dig into that just a little bit more, because that's definitely something that I choose to do. And I mean, I completely agree with you that for me, choosing clipping is much more an aesthetic choice than a technical choice. I mean, it's rare that I would use a limiter so that there's 6 dB of limiting happening. But if that were happening and I was happy with the way that it was sounding, I wouldn't not do that just because, it hit -6 or, for a technical reason in that sense. But what I tend to find is, even with a really good limiter, the sound of 6 dB or more of limiting is probably one that I don't like. It probably takes away too much impact and energy from a snare drum, for example. And that's when I might want to choose clipping instead, because yes, it has a little bit of distortion, and yes, it takes the load off the limiter, but the reason I prefer it is that I prefer the way that it sounds. So I think that's an interesting thing to say. You mentioned that in some ways using saturation in the way you've just described, or smooth, soft clipping, is a little bit like a pre-emphasis process. And that's another option that is available in some clipping plugins. I haven't used Newfangled Saturate yet, but I think you said that has some interesting pre and post emphasis options, because although clipping itself remains a simple process, if you clip something that has, for example, lots of bass content, it will sound very different than you clip something with lots of high frequency content, right? So by, for example, cutting the bass going into a clipper and then adding that bass back in afterwards, you can get a different result. We could do that ourselves using pre and post EQ, but in some cases that's built into the clippers themselves.
Yeah, so the clippers that do that, one of the great things about, particularly Saturate probably does this the best way I've ever tried, because you can move pretty much every slider within it, and it keeps the amount of gain reduction the same. So if you are doing it for this emphasis, pre-emphasis, de-emphasis, whatever we want to call it, going into the next process, you can change the sound of it, the harmonic stuff, the sort of tonal change, without thinking, that could be my limiter afterwards changing, or whatever downstream you've got. I think one of the best ways to get your head around ways to use this is to look at the history of where this was applied and where mastering engineers have famously put this in their processing chain. So going back to from what I can tell is the very, very first digital saturation, soft clipping, whatever you want to call it, was actually the Sony DAL 1000, which is sold as a limiter, although in their later versions, when it's added into other hardware bundles, they actually changed it to clipping, because I'm presuming they realized that the limiting was complicating, the use of limiter was complicating the use in practical sense. And the way that worked was actually in an upwards sense. So it said it was a limiter, but it actually added a certain amount of gain, and it turned everything below 0 up using this transfer curve change, which is the opposite of the TC. Now, TC released their soft clipper slightly afterwards in the MD2. So the curves could be very, very similar, but the effect of turning up the soft clipping in the TC would be essentially turning a threshold down, whereas turning on the soft clipping or the limiting, whatever they wanted to call it, in the Sony, which came out a couple of years earlier with their CD mastering stuff, is actually adding gain. So you can see where a lot of these things have become confused over time. Then you get into things like the Lavery Gold, which is after capturing the signal on the converter, it then does a similar thing to the Sony, where it adds a certain amount of gain up to 0. And then you get into things like the inflator, which does all kinds of mad stuff within itself that's very hard to gain match. So by the time you get to like the 2000s, all of the famous soft clippers working in a completely different way. So I'm very happy personally that the companies that are making them now have cracked this internal gain structure thing, because it means you don't have to build stuff around it. So the example of taking the bass out and putting it back in again, say you put 2 EQs either side of the clipper. One of the problems with doing that within a gain structure is that the adding back in later on will change the peak level again. So you might have taken off 2 dBs of the highest peak, but the second you add EQ, because we know anything that adds a filter changes the shape of the transient, you then lose some of that stuff you've gained. So the really smart people making this stuff right now are able to hide all of this complicated de-emphasis, pre-emphasis stuff within something which just gives you like a transfer curve type thing. And if you look at something like, I've tried to do this, try to match like Inflator against Saturate with exactly the same transfer curve, and then have a look at the harmonics window and the frequency content window in Plugin Doctor, and you'll see they're actually very different. So the transfer curve, as far as the simple mathematic function of the wave shaping, is the same, but what's going on inside the plugin, either side of that, is completely different. And that's where the really smart people, come into this plugin design sort of element.
Yeah, it's super interesting that you're talking about harmonic structure there. And that reminds me of another point that I think we need to get into. So far, we've talked purely about the results of the clipping process itself, but there's a really important ingredient in the sound of all of these processes, which is the other side effects. And those two other side effects are intermodulation distortion and aliasing distortion. We've done an episode on aliasing, so anybody who really wants to dig into that topic can go back and listen to that, but I think we can talk about it quickly. Intermodulation distortion is something that happens with any non-linear process, which clipping definitely is, which basically means not reversible. If you boost something by 3 dBs EQ-wise and then cut by the same EQ shape by the same amount, you'll get something that sounds more or less identical, if not exactly identical, to what you had before. Whereas once you've clipped an audio signal, it can't be unclipped, or not without some super sophisticated modern software, and it probably won't be 100% successful. So that's basically what a nonlinear process means. And what happens is, if we have 2 sine waves and run them through a nonlinear process, what you get out is the result of that process on those 2 sine waves, but also on frequency components that are equal to the sum of those 2 frequencies and the difference. So if the 2 tones were 200 and 300, you would get results coming out that included not only 200 and 300 hertz, but also 500 and 100, because 200 plus 300 is 500 and 300 minus 200 is 100. So you get extra new harmonics basically added into the signal by this intermodulation distortion. And in my experience, it can absolutely dominate the results. It's tempting when you're using Plugin Doctor to look at the different harmonic structure of different clipping algorithms and, wonder how important they are and listen to them and think how they affect the sound. And if you're talking about, say, pure soft clipping, where if you look at the TC, you might not have any harmonics above 5K, for example, being added to an original 1 kilohertz tone. Whereas, as you mentioned right at the top of the show, if you hard clip a 1 kilohertz tone, you'll have harmonics going right up to 20 kilohertz or, whatever sampling frequency you're using. So the harmonic structure is super important to the way the result sounds. And this is why those kind of softer analog emulations tend to often sound more natural and more musically pleasing, because they don't have all those very aggressive high frequency harmonics in there. But every one of those harmonics will interact with every other one of those harmonics and create intermodulation distortion. And of course, we're talking about music, not sine waves. So you look at the harmonic structure of a single sine wave and think you can draw conclusions from it. But when you put an actual music signal through that process, the results can be wildly different and wildly more distorted. And yeah, I often find that the subtle differences between different types of harmonic distortion are completely overwhelmed by the fact that you're just adding a load of intermodulation distortion. Do you agree with that, Joe? Do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is where you start to get into the trying to work out why stuff sounds bad often when you're running these kind of processes. I mean, not only do you have intermodulation distortion, you might have intermodulation distortion between 2 different clippers, because quite a lot of these saturation soft clipping plugins, whatever they're sold as, don't always necessarily just have one wave shaper in them. Some of them have, for example, inflator has two. It has a clip and it has this wave shaper. And when you start balancing between these two different points of change, points of distortion in the signal, like you said, all of that intermodulation distortion goes all over the place as well. You can shunt one bit up and move another bit that way. And you might say, okay, well, I can judge where the harmonics will be because this is going to cause more high frequency, it's going to cause more low frequency harmonics. But yeah, you end up adding these complexities to the sound, which some people think is sort of desirable depending on the material, or is easy to hide on something like an electric guitar that already has so much of that inside it. But there gets a point where it becomes very unpredictable. And once you add in aliasing as well, which of course is determined by the sampling frequency, which is not a musical harmonic thing in most cases, almost all cases, relating to the audio, you've got this whole sequence of extra distortions, which are all interacting with each other, which may or may not sound like anything, or sound bad, or sound different in certain parts of the song, for example. But then when you listen to other parts of the audio, could be this awful, strange, non-musical noise. And this is a big problem when people are doing demonstrations of any sort of nonlinear process, especially compressors. I mean, I'm sure everybody's heard this this really bad mastering compression setting where somebody sets the compressor in one part of the song and then it does something completely different in another part of the song because that's the way compression works. My least favorite is when in rock music the chorus gets quieter because the cymbals make the compressor trigger and the chorus is quieter. Well, then if you think of that in a harmonic sense, that's what some of these sort of clipping settings will do. You might find that in the chorus where the stereo big dense electric guitars are happening, it sounds absolutely fine. But in the verse where the vocal is happening, you might be having all kinds of strangeness happening, you know, in the lower parts of the dynamic of the signal. And that's where this stuff gets quite dangerous because, like a lot of sort of plugins and audio processors, you can drop them on a channel and you can be right, this sounds great. It sounds like I expected, sounds amazing. And I watched a tutorial that says put it on this part of the track or this sort of instrument. But all these other bits and partials are stuck in the signal forever because of that, like you said, nonlinear nature of them.
Yeah, and then we add in the complexity of aliasing distortion. And now you said to me just before we started recording that you had a nice simple way for people to think about aliasing distortion. Why don't you let us know what that is and we'll use that as a kicking off point?
Okay, so the biggest misconception about this, and I've seen lots and lots of TikToks and Reels and YouTube videos about this, is that if you have a Clipper plugin and it has an oversampling, 2 times, 4 times, 8 times, etc., going on for whatever your computer can handle, essentially, that you're somehow adding more detail into the clipped sound, or resolution, which is the most overused term in the history of audio, and misused term in the history of audio, when all the oversampling is doing is it's giving you essentially a sort of pseudo higher sample rate within the plugin to allow that aliasing to not bounce back as soon, if you like, as they go up the harmonic series. So it means that a lot of the distortion, the aliasing distortion, can happen outside of the audible range, and then wrapped inside the plugin, it will then downsample back to the original sample rate of the session, and those things will be sort of filtered out. So it's basically giving you an offset area, if you like, within your bandwidth, within the high frequency, for this stuff that has to happen, and then it gives you a filter back down. So it's basically inverting the original filter. That's why it's often called oversampling as opposed to upsampling, then downsampling, which is all it really is. Because oversampling is it's kind of giving you somewhere over there, if you like to think of it that way, to do this thing, this sort of digital grunge that has to happen. And then it's reducing it as much as possible, coming back into the signal. Now, you won't get rid of all of the aliasing because of maths, but it gives you a way to offset it. Whereas some of the original processors, like a lot of the earlier ones talking about, and the original inflator, I know inflator now has oversampling in it, the original one from the 2000s, and the 90s, I think it was late 90s, maybe inflator, didn't have any of that. So part of the sound that people liked or didn't like was actually also this aliasing distortion. So it's massively misunderstood. And because people sell these processors a lot as this sort of one trick, make your audio sound better, enhance is the word that's often used. All it's doing is distorting the signal. That's literally all it is. It's whether or not that distortion is good or bad. And putting the number of the oversampling up isn't going to make that distortion any more specific or with higher resolution. It just offsets some of that stuff.
Yeah, the way I like to think about it is it just makes it lower level. You know, if you hard clip something with no oversampling, which is how it used to be back in the day, you know, back when hard digital clipping was, you could get fired as a mastering engineer for allowing hard digital clipping, and a CD master might be rejected from the plant by having more than 3 samples at any point in an hour-long program that hit 0 dB. One of the reasons that sounded so bad is that it would alias really badly. So again, as you mentioned right at the top of the show, if hard clipping is almost like square waving some of the frequencies in the signal, and that therefore adds, in theory, an infinite number of high harmonics, but certainly harmonics that do not drop off as the frequency increases, you know, so lots and lots of high frequency, unmusical harmonics being added to the signal. The aliasing will then cause any of those that go above 20 kilohertz to actually, as you say, get bounced back or reflected back down below 20 kilohertz. So you get even more distortion, and then they all intermodulate with each other. So the degree of distortion, you know, if you, again, a nice trick in Plugin Doctor is to take a clipper plugin, set it up with hard clipping, take a look at the harmonic structure, and just disable oversampling in the plugin, and just look at what happens to the distortion components. So, yeah, if you use oversampling, or if you're using a higher sample rate, you will just get a lot less of that fizz, that digital fizz being added. It'll just drop down in level. I agree with you that oversampling doesn't add detail, but I guess it reduces mush, which can perhaps reveal some detail, or at least, you know, not make things worse. And this seems like a great point to move into possibly the most important thing we've talked about in this episode, well over an hour in, which is that whether or not to use clipping, what type of clipping to use, and how you use it probably depends most importantly on what we are clipping, what the material is, what the source material is. And I think that my favorite example of that is to think about transients. You know, transients are these very brief, high-level moments at the start of a signal, and they actually are often quite noise-like. If you chopped off everything but the very transient of a snare, it's probably a little sound. You know, same with hi-hats. There's a lot of high-frequency noise in the, they don't have a pitch as such. You know, if there's a snare or a tom or something with a pitch, it comes much later in the sound, well after the transient. And the interesting thing is that if you clip something that is already noise and add a load more noise in the way that I just described, you know, say you hard clip it with no oversampling, it's not going to change the sound of that noise very much. Added into which, that noise was probably very, very brief to begin with. And with a transient, you know, the big spike at the beginning of a snare drum only happens over a very short period of time. So even though clipping is absolutely not a transparent process, if you compare the effect of a really fast limiter dropping the level of that transient by 6 dB with just clipping the top off of that signal and it becoming either maybe slightly noisier or a slightly different type of noise, actually the clipping on that signal can sound more transparent, can sound more invisible. So even though hard clipping technically is a bad thing to do, in that situation, it could be a perfectly logical and actually musical choice. Whereas hard clipping a sustained tone, like, you know, the pitch of a piano and vocals, I find are two things where clipping distortion is immediately blatantly obvious, hard clipping, I should say, blatantly obvious and unpleasant, because they are not noise-like at all, really. They're almost pure pitch, pure, you know, the original harmonic series of the instrument. Once the transient has happened, it's all about the pitch. So clipping something that is sustained is going to sound often ugly, whereas clipping something that is fast can often sound invisible. And the opposite can apply to limiting. So this is why lots of modern limiters actually include a certain amount of clipping in their algorithms. Two options that we haven't talked about because they're limiters rather than clippers would be the FabFilter Pro L or for example, the Tokyo Dawn Limiter 6. Both of those, well, Limiter 6 is different because it actually has a specific, you can see separately that here is the clipper, here is the limiter, and you can choose which bits to enable and disable and move them around. Whereas in the FabFilter, there are settings that have a certain amount of clipping built into the sound, but it's not, it's not like there's a clipping dial that you can just play with. In fact, I just got a test version yesterday of a new limiter that's been released by Leapwing Audio, the guys who make Stage 1, Center 1 plugins that I really, really like. Dyne 1, which is a very cool multiband compressor expander plugin. They have a new one called, I think it's called Limit 1. And
nice.
It specifically has a clipping dial that you can move up and down. And I'm having some interesting conversations with Robin about exactly what that does and how the clipping sounds, because it doesn't expose a load of the other details. But it's another situation where clipping can be part of a limiter and built in. And of course, then if you use a clipper and a limiter, they can interrelate and, the results can modulate against each other, as you mentioned. So yes, I think short version of all of that, the source material is super important as to whether or not, with all musical processes, right, but particularly with clipping, as to whether it's going to be appropriate or not. That was a really long rant from me. Joe, what do you want to say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's becoming more common, adding some element of instantaneous wave shaping, clipping, etc., into the actual limiter plugin. I know that I don't use FabFilter, I use Ozone as my main sort of standard mastering limiter, the Ozone Maximizer. And they recently added in a similar thing where it's like it's trying to balance the amount of limiting and the soft clipper. So as you add the soft clipper in, it takes things out of the limiter, but it does it inside the plugin. So it's kind of a slightly more sophisticated way of doing it. That's becoming more often. Yeah, the limiter number 6 has it where you can actually move it around as well. Like you can change the audio yourself. So it's kind of a slightly more of a sort of toolbox sort of way of doing it. I mean, one of the other ways that the hard clippers, as well as drums and stuff, how it's saying how a lot of transient sounds actually start with noise. Well, there's also synthesized music, which often uses noise to create a fake transient. I don't know if you've ever had this where someone sent you an electronic project and it's completely electronic, created using synthesizers and DAW, etc. And the peaks that can create are completely bonkers because they're not necessarily related to acoustic sound. So they're not even necessarily having to, vibrate through air and therefore have a nice bit of symmetry where you can see the transient and then it tails off into the next bit of the window of the sound, if you like. And you'll often get sort of weird asymmetrical stuff or insanely high peaks on the start of one synthesized sound. And hard clipping is really great for that because, again, you're literally just chopping the top off something, which is an incredibly large spike of actual noise created by a noise generator. So for electronic music, where you're trying to keep the bass sustaining perfectly, like I've done this a lot with things that have insane amounts of bass but have these like tiny little clicky noises in them. That's what I use standard clip for generally, is for that kind of stuff. You can just take it out without even anybody ever knowing that you've changed the sound of it. Whereas if you had a limiter, you'd hear that attack and release, that would cut into the bass and you'd hear this dip, or that dip would create, if it was very fast, would create unpleasant harmonics. I mean, on the complete other side of it, where to use incredibly soft clipping is stuff where you're trying to keep the harmonic content into the low frequency. So this is a little bit like tape machines. Now, a lot of people will say, oh yeah, people never used to use, gain reducing things like limiters and compressors back in the day when music was better, 70s, whatever. People, all their sort of reactionary opinions about music. And the reality is that almost everything that was recorded in that time would have been run through several essentially very soft clippers. Tape, anything that has a transformer, anything that uses an inducer, basically everything. Microphone preamps, all of these things were non-linear. So the sound, if you like, a lot of like old acoustically recorded stuff, especially drum sounds, those classic 60s and 70s drum sounds, it's not that they're not being changed dynamically. It's just they're not being changed with compressor plugins and brick wall limiters. They're being changed with these lots and lots of complex series of essentially soft clippers. Not only are they soft clippers, they also have this thing which I mentioned earlier called hysteresis, which is kind of like a memory effect, if you like to think of it that way, with this. So there's this time smearing as well with all of these processes. So the non-linear distortion has been present in music to the very start of the history of recorded sounds, and very early on people found musical uses for it. So there's nothing new about thinking about changing the shape of the wave to get a musical result. It's been there for as long as tape and microphone preamps have.
Well, as you mentioned, it's the main ingredient of a distorted guitar sound, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then you get into speaker distortion and all the rest of it, and it gets even more complicated. Yeah, I think that's quite a good place maybe to round this off. I think we've hit most of the topics we wanted to. Let me know, Joe, if you think there's anything we need to add or anything you want to kind of go into in any more detail. But in the meantime, I'll say that we are going to be adding a load of resources to the show notes for this episode, because talking about this stuff is like dancing about architecture. It does help to be able to see some waveforms, to be able to see some graphs. And there are a bunch of resources out there that will enable you to do that, including, for example, Plugin Doctor. So do head over to themasteringshow.com and take a look at the show notes for this episode if you'd like to dig into this in more detail. Yeah, do you think there's anything else we need to add at this point, Joe?
The only thing I would say now is that the most important thing to watch first would be that you don't understand saturation video. I would literally watch that several times in a row. It's only 17 minutes long. It's by someone called S-Seb, so S-S-E-B. And he shows not only the stuff we've been talking about, but he also explains how you can get that guitar amp distortion, how it's all related. And I think before you get into trying this stuff out, it would be good to watch that video specifically. And also, I would say, listen to the nonlinear distortion episode. If anybody's got to this point and they're just like, I'm completely lost, I think everybody can get there eventually, but there are certain things to watch first. And also just ignore the press release of any saturation soft clipper plugin you've ever read. Just ignore them. Like, don't, because they will sell you the world and you'll be very confused when you drop it on your audio track. So yeah, get Plugin Doctor and watch those videos first.
Excellent. And if anybody's interested in that episode on nonlinear processing, that was episode number 79 with Dan Worrell, who did a fantastic job of helping me talk about another topic that is so mathematical that talking about it kind of doesn't make any sense. And yeah, I would agree with everything that Joe just said. I would just add, however much you think you've understood this or you think you understand it after watching those videos, at the end of the day, all of this stuff is about testing what it sounds like and figuring out if it sounds good or not. And if you want to do that, you have to loudness match. You have to level match, using Perception AB or using something that's built into the plugin if it has it, or just by ear, although that can be quite tricky to get right, or by measuring the LUFS before and after you apply the process. If you're hearing or noticing a gain change. I tried this myself. I was just literally trying to get the same transfer curves in Plugin Doctor as preparation for this episode. I was like, okay, well, I think I know what that plugin does. What does it really do? Let me fire up, have a look at the harmonics and the dynamic processing and all the rest of it. Just getting two different plugins to give me the same transfer curve so that I could confirm that, yes, the knee is reasonably similar there, for example, was insanely difficult. So yeah, when you want to listen to this stuff, you have to find a way of matching the gain before and after so that you can bypass the plugin and hear for yourself, what are all those extra harmonics doing? What has the change to that wave shape done to the sound? Do I like it? Is it musically appropriate? And yes, as you mentioned there, I think that's a really important point. Does it work all the way through the song? Maybe it works in the loud sections. Does it also work in the quiet sections or not? So yeah, that probably is a good place to stop. Joe, thank you so much for suggesting this episode and for all the chats we had leading up to it and the resources you've shared and some interesting new ideas for me to try. With having started the episode by complaining about how many people there were talking about clipping, I do think recording this episode might make me experiment and go out and use clipping more, or in slightly different ways than I have done before. So yeah, thanks for being here.
Thanks very much for having me.
As always, you can find more resources, as I mentioned, at themasteringshow.com. Thanks to John for editing and mixing the episode. Thanks to Kaylee Law for letting us use his music. Thanks for listening.